All right.
Just tell us when, Iron Geek.
Okay.
Thanks, sir. All right. We're getting going. So let me be the first to introduce you to whose idea was that, which is going to be a comparative analysis between curriculum and accreditation to what the industry, the security industry, wants and needs from a capability perspective.
And expects.
And expects from a capability perspective. Contrary to what it says on the schedule, there's actually more to the title than just whose idea was that, so I'm glad you guys all stuck out for that. To my right here, I have the lovely and beautiful Robert Olson. I myself am Chaim Sanders, and together we make what is known as Robium. Some of better parts. Now, the only reason that we're known as Robium is mostly because Chob is a pretty awful name, but we actually do have a couple things in common together. Probably the most important of which is that for a time at least, until very recently, we both served as full-time lecturers at the Rochester Institute of Technology, about 3 hours that way. Now, as part of this position, that way.
I think.
Now, as part of this position, we actually had a really cool insight into what we are teaching students, which is very nice for us because Rob and I both, relatively speaking, socially engineered our way into academia. He came from computer science, a little bit more legitimate. I came from industry, having worked with some of the people in this room and going back to education. And in that capability, we got to see some things, and we also got to contribute. So we represented 2/4 of the Computing Security Department's Curriculum Committee. And you'll learn in a couple seconds just how rare that sentence put together actually is. But the decisions were essentially, what in the curriculum do we need to keep? What do we need to remove? And what do we need to update? And as part of that research, or as part of that question, we needed to research what other people are doing. And we needed to know what industry needed, which is pretty standard across the board. So we said, wow, this is actually, as non-really faculty full-time, although we both were doing it full-time at the time. Now I'm working for a company called ZeroFox as a director of security. At the time, we were both doing that, and we said, this is actually really interesting information for everybody at large. In doing that, we will come into a couple of different organizations. I should mention right now, right from the get-go, we don't represent any of these, and most of these are acronym soup that we'll explain later. So we don't speak for the ACM, we don't speak for IBET, we don't speak for the IEEE, RIT, the NSA. If you can throw any 4-letter acronym, 3-letter acronym together, we don't speak for them. This is our own personal opinion. So this is going to be pretty interesting to us as we go forward. When we started coming up with this, we had to come up with our research questions. Well, we came up with 4, and they're pretty interesting, but really they all boiled down to a pretty general idea of when was the last time you actually thought about who's behind a given curriculum, and why does that even matter to you? Why do you even care? That's the important things to consider here. And the why do we care is obviously the first question we want to know before we start thinking about who's behind it. And the answer should be pretty obvious. The answer should be the first one coming to your mind. And that's everybody and their mother has told me that there's a humongous talent gap in information security. And that's why I'm telling all my friends to go into it and my kids to go into it. But the question becomes, for anybody who's researching anything, is that true? And if so, can we evaluate how much we're impacting that? Well, it turns out that the only data that is actually based on what seems to be source of statistics and collection is from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, appropriately so. However, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics only collects on one area of information security, and that's information security analysts. And according to their data, there are 90,000 of them in the US. 90,000. That sounds oddly low. For instance, if we put this into a count of this room, we'd note that 2 out of every 9 of you in the room right now, and in fact in the entire industry, would have attended DEF CON last year if that was the case. Now, I don't think even the people who are at a conference right now, that's representative. In fact, there are other figures, although they're based on less data, that span humongous amounts of ranges. They have a large discrepancy. In fact, the discrepancy is as large almost as the amount of people who allegedly illegally voted for Donald Trump this last election. So keep that in mind. And by when we say large, we mean if we look at the currently employed figures in the US, there's a discrepancy of 1 million people. That seems like a lot. It seems like we could maybe we moved that down a little bit. The same thing is true with jobs that are available. You would think that this data would be pretty easily obtained. You can even think of sources where this might come from, job search engines, for instance. The problem here is when you search for security or even computer security in job search engines, you'll get the malware reverse engineer, but you'll also get the guy whose job it is to physically secure the computer by standing in front of it with a gun, also known as a security guard. Both of those guys will come up along with multiple listings, so you got to take these with a grain of salt. And all of these organizations that have tried to put out these numbers have different methodologies for doing so. The important thing to think about, however, or the important thing to remember, I should say, is we're going to take the most conservative one, which we think is pretty much CyberSeek. Combined, we have about 1.1 million total jobs that are needed, including the ones that are already there. Remember that for a couple slides from now. Now, when we're talking about the jobs that exist, we need to know what the need is for new students. We say there's somewhere around 200,000, maybe 500,000, could be anywhere. How many students are we pumping out? This should be easy to answer, right? There's no way we don't have this data. Actually, we don't have anywhere near this data. It turns out this is one of the most fiercely protected things from academia that there is. The only data we do have is from our IT because, well, I can just simply go up and say, like, what is the data? So we actually get to see that this data goes back 10 years, which is actually extremely long in the computing security academia world, but is so all over the place that it doesn't necessarily add up. There's a huge spike recently, and we've been seeing upwards of 100 people per year graduating, or I should say attending, which is about a 400-person total department, as opposed to the early years when we're looking at a department that's maybe 120. This data can't really be compared. What we can say, however, is that this is probably one of the larger computing security departments that there are. I think that's pretty much obvious. And that there's also no way to clearly evaluate or colleges and academic programs for their success, which is something that we kind of pointed out and we'll be pointing out as we go forward. Now, in order to kind of come up with this, we're going to use those assumptions that we just came up with. The conservative estimate is that we need about 1.1 million jobs, which is going to be nice. And we're going to assume that, let's say, as the data actually shows, that about 75% of students graduate from a given program. I know that seems high, but it's actually the data that we have. That includes people dropping out, switching majors, whatever. If that's the case, out of 120 students attending, we have about 90 that will graduate from one of the larger programs. Let's go all out. Let's say there are 137 four-year schools. We'll see where we get that 137 number from soon. It's probably slightly low, but it's pretty close to straight on for reasons we'll discuss in a little bit. If we take that and we multiply it by the largest amount of class that we'd expect them all to have, keeping in mind this is obviously unrealistic, we end up with a pretty solid number, 12,330 CSEC students per year. Unrealistic for reasons we talked about, but it's an estimate at least. It's better than some of the things we've seen up on the board so far. All right, so if we went at that pace for the entire time, for the entire lifespan of an employee, and tried to fill all the existing computing security jobs there were in the average lifetime of a normal person who works, which is about 40 years, we end up with a little bit of a problem, right? We said adding those CyberSeek numbers together, there are 1.1 million total jobs. I'm going to assume that most of you are going to work about 40 years, but maybe some of you are going to put some 60s in. We'll account for that. But let's just divide that by 40, and that means that we're going to be needing to fill about 28,000 students per year on average. Now, even if we were off by 40 years, even if you all worked for 80 years, we'd still be short. So I think this is pretty good cause for the fact that A, we have this whole situation where we have individuals who are generating computing security talent. We should make sure that they do a good job, and we should make sure that not only is that job the best that they can do, but it prepares the students for the jobs they want. Now, there's an important caveat here, and this important caveat comes up occasionally when we start going over this note, and that is there are other things besides academia that are preparing people for their employment. There are things like certifications, there are things like training, there's things like Army training and things like that as well. Many of those require that there's a significant financial deposit put on, I should say. So take a look at, for instance, SANS training. Going rate of SANS training is about $5,700 for a course. Same thing for Black Hat, it's about $5,000 for a training course. In these cases, if you have low capabilities in the financial space, read as most students, you're probably not going to be jumping straight into this. In fact, the people who are probably going to be providing you the capability to afford that are employers. And if employers are paying for your training and you need to get a job before you can do that, it's kind of a chicken before the egg problem that we run into several times over. Anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just startups too.
Oh, yes. Good times. So we have this kind of issue, and it's the thing that comes out is we have an information security talent shortage. The real takeaway here is we actually don't know how large it is. We just know that it's kind of there. Intrinsically, that seems correct, but there's also data that indicates that as well.
One other thing, too. It's worth mentioning that for these job titles that we're talking about, these are jobs that explicitly mention security. And as we all know, there are many, many other jobs out there that are related to security that don't necessarily have security in their title or their description.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. A reliability asset engineer, maybe some of you play that position now. Information analyst, all of these deal with security on a day-to-day basis and don't mention security directly in the title. All right, excellent. So we have this kind of base. Now there's another kind of area that we need to think about. Sure, we're not considering things like certifications and training and things like that. We're only focusing on academia, but I think we can all agree that there's a large proportion here of academia that funnels into the real employability of students and eventually employees. Now the question also becomes, within academia, can we evaluate curricula in a vacuum? And the answer is absolutely no. That's ridiculous to assume. There are things like clubs and research and internships that play into this. Now, we're not going to try and evaluate that because that's pretty difficult. However, it is kind of an interesting conjecture to make that the quality of your academic program will allow your students to, A, undertake better research, have more informed clubs, and get better internships. I don't think that's a tremendous leap, although there's certainly some wiggle room within that definition. Now, when talking about that, we're going to evaluate a number of different programs, and that's going to be what we start doing for a little bit right after this slide. The reason why this is the case is obviously because computing security is not within the Department of Computing Security in almost any college. That's a ridiculous claim to make. So in order to evaluate how security fits in and where and the effectiveness of it, we're going to need to evaluate the computer science curriculum, the information systems curriculum, and the information technology curriculum, in addition to any computing security curriculums that might be available. In order to do that, we're going to have to become familiar with quite a few organizational acronyms. The first one is ACM, which many of you are familiar with. It's the Association of Computing Machinery. And this is an interesting organization from a curriculum perspective. They set forth a number of curriculum guidelines, kind of we think these subjects should be important, and we'll see those come through later. Now that alone doesn't seem that important until you take them in conjunction with the next acronym on our list, ABET. ABET no longer stands for anything. That's about where we're at right now.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment.
Yes, they were like, ABET, that used to stand for something, but now it's just letters capitalized. All right. ABET is designed and sets forth very specific curriculum that universities need to follow in order to obtain accreditation. And this is something that they can use, and pretty much the main reason for this is for marketing purposes. You get this accreditation to say that you're accredited. Now, the benefit of this is they have strict guidelines and requirements that need to be reviewed by the ABET accrediting board to assure that your program is in compliance with that situation. So you say, I have ABET accreditation in computing science. You must fulfill certain requirements in order to do that.
Which is a very expensive process in many cases.
Yes. That is the kind of other elephant in the room, is that ABET actually makes a hefty profit off of this situation.
One other thing, too. So when talking about accreditation, we're talking about subject-specific accreditations. Institutional accreditation is a whole different beast. So something like Middle States, that's there for more than just marketing. Yeah, Middle States also doesn't get as granular as what does your computing security department cover.
That's just never going to be part of that. All right, thank you. So there's one other kind of big and awkward elephant in the room, and that is one of the somewhat important organizations in this conversation is going to be the National Security Agency. Now, 50 years ago, many of you would not know who that is, but I expect you all to have a pretty firm understanding of what the National Security Agency does at this point. Now, what you're thinking is probably completely incorrect unless you're from academia for this context. In this context, the NSA actually serves a role very similar to that of ABET. They, instead of accrediting, because they don't use that term, it's very specifically designated, they use the term designation. You can get a National Security Agency designation, and as we'll see, these actually turn out to be some of the most important designations in the computing security curriculum. So we're going to take a little bit of a look into the computer science and information security and information systems, information technology and information systems curriculums, and then we'll kind of come back and try and fetch out the security relevance of each of those. Rob?
Yeah, so let's start off by taking a look at the ACM computer science curriculum. So what we have up here are the required knowledge units, the subjects, if you will. They don't necessarily translate to specific courses. And then we have the amount of time that each one of these subjects is, that students are supposed to be exposed to each one of these subjects. So the tier 2, these T1 and T2 columns are measured in instructional hours. So that's not credit hours. In terms of, we typically talk about one course as a 3-credit hour course. These are instructional hours, which means for this number of hours, you're supposed to be in the room with an instructor. Okay? T1, Tier 1 are mandated. You have to have at least these many instructional hours in a particular subject area. Tier 2 are optional, meaning that you're strongly encouraged to have some high number, but the exact percentage of the T2 column isn't actually specified in terms of what students are supposed to get. Now, if we take a look at some of these numbers, they make sense for computer science. If we look at software development fundamentals, 43 instructional hours. That's basically one whole semester. One whole semester. In one semester, you typically take 3 one-hour lectures a week, approximately, for 15 weeks, adding up to 45 instructional hours over the course of a semester. Okay? 43 is about one course. Makes sense for someone who's a computer science major, who's going to be going probably into a developer position or something of that nature. If we look at where security falls in this, by comparison, we're looking at 3 instructional hours. All right? From the ACM's perspective, computer science students need 1 week of lecture on security as a requirement. Yeah, let's just think about that for a second. 1 hour. And then some percentage of an additional 6 hours, some presumably high percentage of an additional 6 hours. Now, it's worth noting, too, that this information assurance and security subject or knowledge unit only came into existence in the 2013 version. Before 2013, it wasn't even recognized as a distinct subject area. Instead, it was rolled into other places such as networking and communications, which still covers a fair amount of security content, and operating systems. So those are places where one is likely to get crypto, additional crypto, where one is likely to get concepts like access control and that sort of thing. But we can see here that it's very clear that ACM does not put a high priority on this, at least for computer science. And if we delve a little bit more deep into what specifically those 3 to 9 credit hours are supposed to be, it gets even a little, for lack of a better word, sillier. Okay? So a computer science major, someone who's supposed to be a developer, is going to have 1 credit hour, or 1 lecture on fundamental concepts in security. Yeah, one lecture. Okay? 1 to 2 lectures on principles of secure design. 1 to 2 lectures on defensive programming, which is arguably the thing that they need most. And I'm going to skip down to the bottom here. 1 lecture hour, 1 lone lecture hour to learn everything they need to know about cryptography.
Seems right.
Yeah, seems right? Is it any wonder why we see companies still storing passwords in the clear? IT is a little bit different. Oh, I'm sorry, we're not there yet. So if we delve into what a course looks like, for ACM, typically these disciplines that have fewer numbers of required credit hours tend to be electives. That's where they tend to fall in actual implementations of this curriculum. So what we have here is a detailed dive into one of these electives, which is kind of interesting. So the focus, there seems to be two large focuses here, and that's application security, which is a good thing. There is about 13 instructional hours over the course of a semester in application security. Also, this doesn't seem to translate too well with what we just saw a minute ago. Even though this is supposed to be the course that implements those requirements, it's certainly going beyond what's required there. And network security. Okay, so what we don't see are a lot of things like policy. I think perhaps the discussion of threats and attacks might be a little bit low. But overall, this probably isn't a bad elective. It probably isn't sufficient for someone to end up coming out of this to be a developer. They might want a little bit more. Certainly, it would be good if this could be reinforced in other classes. But this itself isn't necessarily a bad class. Probably, though, this is not sufficient to be a security engineer. Okay, so if you're recruiting a security engineer, you're from a computer science school, that student might have gotten this class, if you're lucky. So IT is a different beast. Okay, IT is the hands-on, less programming, more geared towards system administration and networking. Here, information assurance is certainly placed at a much higher value, which is a good thing. Okay, you can see it's ranked 5th in terms of the amount of required instructional hours. So ACM doesn't break this down into Tier 1 and Tier 2 as they do for computer science. There's just one credit hour number. And information assurance is reasonably high. It's on par with some other things that are probably related, integrated tech, and also social and professional issues. So we're seeing a fair amount of information there. Okay. Still, though, a reasonably large focus on programming fundamentals, which is ranked at number 1, even though we're talking, and as well as math and statistics. Even though we're talking about someone who's more likely to come out and be a network or system administrator. Those seem more theoretical. I mean, certainly it's not bad, but it's an interesting choice. This particular, I believe this curriculum dates from 2008 is the most recent version of this. And then we have information systems, which is, again, its own beast. Information systems doesn't get into required credit hours. Instead, they actually specify courses. So what we have here are the courses that an information systems major, a less technical discipline, is supposed to take. And the ones marked with a little green asterisk are the ones that have some kind of security content, some kind of significant security content. So I think one of the things that's interesting about this is that we see security being reinforced more in the curriculum. For ACM, for the CS and IT versions of this, there is reinforcement, but it's not necessarily clearly spelled out. Okay? The way that the subject matter is broken down, it'd be very easy for for a professor or an instructor who isn't as security focused to skip over that optional material. Okay? For the information systems requirements, though, that's spelled out a lot more, and we see a lot higher amount of reinforcement, including 2 suggested elective courses, IT Audit and Control and IT Security and Risk Management, which we're about to delve into. So here we have the those 2 electives and their actual suggested subject matter. Okay, so we see a number of common topics here that would not necessarily be a bad thing for someone going into the security profession to have. Okay, is this going to produce someone who is a security engineer? Again, probably not. would this be good for someone who's getting into risk management or policy or an auditing type position? Okay, that seems reasonable. Maybe that's not too crazy. And then we get to ABET. Okay? ABET, as we sort of said, is its own beast. Now, the curriculum guidelines that we just talked about come from ACM. No one actually has to do those. These are things that ACM says are important. Okay, we think you should have this amount, but we're not actually going to verify. You can really do whatever the hell you want in your program. Just don't say you adhere to our standards. If you actually want to be accredited, that accreditation comes from ABET, and they have a very, very strict set of requirements for this. So you start off with, for computer science, you have to have 40 credit hours in these core computer science concepts. Notice what's not there. Okay. Additionally, for computer science, you also have to have a surprising amount of mathematics and traditional science. Okay. So the amount of mathematics and science you are supposed to take in an ABET accredited program is roughly equivalent, maybe 3/4 of the amount of computer science you're supposed to take. So, again, an interesting choice. But at no point do they actually require students going out to be programmers to take security. Okay? And that's kind of how we get bugs, right? The IT requirements are a little bit interesting. It doesn't go, again, for IT, ABET doesn't go quite into as much detail as it does for computer science. Computer science is kind of the flagship for both ACM and ABET. This, for IT, it does require that students get exposed to the fundamentals of security, information assurance and security. So at least here we have a clear requirement that students are supposed to take some kind of security. Okay? And that an ABET accredited IT program should mean that students are actually getting security content, right? Well, as we all know from discussions of policy and policy implementation, what's missing from this? Okay, what's missing from this? Well, you can prescribe policy all that you want, but what do you actually have to do if you want to make sure that that policy is being implemented? You have to audit. So we're going to lead into a discussion of auditing in higher ed in a second, called assessment. But just to give you a little bit of a heads up, everything might not be quite as rosy as we think. And for information systems, there is, again, a explicit mention of covering security of information systems required. It is one of several topics that's supposed to be within 30 credit hours. So that's 30 credit hours, not 30 instructional hours. So in other words, somewhere in about 1 of 10 classes, you're supposed to get this material. Okay, it doesn't specify exactly how much of those 10 classes you're supposed to get, but it's in there. So if we look at what actually happens in terms of auditing this stuff, so we see that 2 of these 3 accreditations actually require security content. Who audits that, though? Well, maybe 1. Okay, in other words, when we actually go through to see our students learning the security that they're supposed to be learning, only 1 of the 3 accreditations actually requires that schools make sure students are getting the security content they're supposed to be getting. So if we look at the relevant ABET outcomes here, okay, so we have one general outcome that applies to all ABET accreditation programs: understanding of professional, ethical, legal, security, and social issues and responsibilities. That is one of the very few places where security is explicitly mentioned in these learning outcomes. Now, these learning outcomes are supposed to translate into assessment criteria, meaning that this is something students are supposed to know, and you have to come up with some way to measure their knowledge of this. Okay? So we see this being applied as a whole to all programs. Okay? It is up to the individual programs to determine how this specific learning outcome gets assessed. You do have to have some kind of plan in writing. But if we look at what CS actually requires, in addition to this one general learning outcome, it's all theoretical. Okay, CS requires understanding of algorithms, of mathematics, of problem solving, but there's no CS-specific version of security that we're supposed to measure students' knowledge of. Although they do very much care about complexity, and reasonably so. So IT is sort of in a similar state. That is, we have a number of learning outcomes that we're supposed to measure for accreditation in IT programs, but security is not explicitly mentioned. At best, we might be able to shoehorn an assessment of security into this learning outcome of an understanding of best practices and standards. Okay? Understanding and implementing security is certainly a best practice, but it would be easy for a school to redefine this to avoid security entirely. So the school is supposed to teach security within an ABET accredited IT program, but they don't actually have to measure the effectiveness of teaching security. And again, for information systems, we have one additional learning outcome which does not mention security at all. All right? We have an understanding to support the use, delivery, and management of information systems, and that's sort of it. You have something on that?
Excellent. All right, cool. So we have all these sweet learning outcomes. We have a pretty good idea of where each of these programs falls in relationship to how they teach security. Thank God, probably security is all coming in a dedicated computing security department with really effective back-end from computing science and information systems and information technology. Right? No, actually. So we worked really hard to actually get this data, manually going through each computing security coursework and finding out which department they belong into, and then separating that out. That data will be available later for anyone who's interested. But essentially, the idea is that almost half of all programs slop security into computing science. Now, that might sound a little bit problematic given that the previous requirements we just talked about had very little capacity for security to be taught as part of the underlying accreditation process, or at least very little monitoring of the security platform. Now, we do see a rising amount in computing security as its own independent department kind of area, and that's under the white. And the third largest one is actually surprisingly information systems, which has 17%. Now we're going to see that this actually can become a little bit dangerous as we go forward. But what we're going to be talking about here, this data set represents all of the schools that have NSAs, and we'll be talking about this in a couple seconds, CAECD, CAER, and CAECO. And it also represents every school that has ever competed in any CCDC competition, just because I felt like adding those in, and sometimes they didn't overlap.
It's worth mentioning, too, that there's also a surprising amount of engineering.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. Some schools find a really high capacity for putting engineering capabilities or security within engineering capabilities, which actually makes some sense to it, especially going forward. Now, what's interesting is we're actually going to see that these NSA accreditations, or I should say designations, actually mirror these distributions really well, which shouldn't be that surprising to you because they actually want people to get them. So what are these NSA things? What's up with this NSA dealing with accreditation and curriculum? Well, probably the thing that happened was at some point they said, wow, no one's doing this. We should really do this so we can get the people we want. And actually, that's a fantastic idea. However, there's a couple little problems with it that we'll discuss later. But generally, they provide 3 different capabilities. One is the CAECD, that's in cyber defense. And we've put a little description that we feel represents these best. So, high-level security blue team. The CAECO, which is the newest one, cyber operations. State-sponsored offense. You'll see why we say that in a couple of minutes. And the CAER, which is defined towards cybersecurity academics, but there's actually no curriculum requirements for this. It's all just how many papers have you published, so on and so forth. So within these designations, what do you get? Now, we said earlier with things like ABET, what do you get? Well, you get a price tag and you have to pay it, and then you can maybe use it in marketing. It turns out that no one has ABET accreditation for security itself because it doesn't exist yet. And as a result, no one really wants it, right? Everybody has gotten this NSA CAE accreditation. And this is essentially what's used to judge whether or not you're at some minimum accreditation level, even though it's technically a designation. That's great news for the NSA, and there's actually a little carrot that they use to encourage you to do it. You can get additional grants and scholarships if you are participating in one of these programs. So that works out for everybody involved, theoretically.
It's worth noting, too, that ABET is going to have a marketing issue going forward, in that who has heard of ABET versus who has heard of NSA?
Well, it didn't used to be that way back in my day. So in any event, there's 170 schools, four-year schools that are measured here. Only 13 of them have the new CAE-CO. We'll be talking about why that might be the case. 67 of them have the CAE-R, the research one, and 136, the vast majority, have the CAE-CD. With a few, they have to re-register every 4 years, so only a few have re-registered in the last few years. The CAE-CD and CAE-R overlap most commonly, and 39 schools have both. So just think about this as we go forward, and we start kind of presenting what's in these actual designations. So the first one is the CAE-CD. The CAE-CD is fantastically interesting because it's broken into three components. One is the core 2-year, which is going to be required for everybody, regardless of whether you're a 2-year institution or a 4-year. Then there's the 4-year core, which is required for all 4 years. And then if you're a 4-year institution, you also have some optional knowledge units, or KUs, that you can have. We've color-coded these according to where we think they fall within the traditional curriculum. So the orangish, pinkish thing, the second one from the top, that's going to be computing science. The purple one is going to be information systems. The green one is going to be IT. And the white one is going to be, well, security or somewhere else that doesn't really make any sense.
We also have an orange one here for things that don't fit any of these traditional technology disciplines. So that's going to, as we see here with probability and statistics, that's going to cover a number of wildly different things going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Oops, sorry about that. Absolutely. So this is going to be one of the most interesting areas for us. And you'll note that within the CD, we don't actually see a lot of things like application security, right? We see within the 2-year course, programming and or basic scripting. That sounds like one course. And then we see a bunch of OS level stuff at the optional area. When we start moving into the CAE-CD optional curriculum, we actually see that this is broken down pretty much spot on to how we saw the distribution, where first we see a large computing science set of classes, then we see the second most common one is the information systems one, then we see IT, and we also see information security kind of built in here as well.
So it's worth noting that students have to take, in order for the school to get this designation, students have to be able to take any 5 of these.
And historically, an interesting kind of caveat to the CD is they don't actually have to be able to take them in one sequence out of one program. They could be anywhere in the institution.
Well, that's changing.
That is changing, or changed. Now, also, one of the interesting aspects here is we see that there's quite a bit of engineering here. Really, this seems to be somewhat well designed to make it so that most institutions who teach these courses somewhere can get this accreditation or this designation.
Including some business ones with like fraud prevention and forensic accounting.
Now, that's true. And for the most part, these actually are fairly reasonable. For instance, this is the requirements for cryptography. They make sense. They're not all too out there. We'd expect people to have a pretty good idea of what elements of cryptography were in use. Where this gets really interesting is when we start talking about the CO, the newest one. Now, our claim earlier was that this was designed for state-sponsored offense, and we'll see that this is actually going to be reflected a little bit in what's represented here. So, first and foremost, we have a lot of computing science here. We see low-level programming. This is clearly more application security heavy. Additionally, we see some networking, but we really see a startling lack of information systems. Now, most interesting here, there's something that's missing from this list. Rob, what do you think that is?
I don't know. Maybe you should tell us what the answer is.
Ethics? Do we see any ethics? No, we do not.
What we see is legal.
We do see legal. Now, I don't know how many of you are information security experts in your day job, but when was the last time you needed to whip out your local copy of the Constitutional Amendment? Or the Geneva Convention? We got constitutional... okay, what about just war clauses? Have you used those recently? Just war clauses? No, yeah. So that is actually required by this core KUs. As we go forward, we can take a look at some of the optional KUs, which get really kind of interesting. Some of them are really specific. A lot of things on mobile. There's some things on systems programming and digital forensics. They're a little bit all over the place. Students here need to take 10 of these core KUs at least at some point during their capabilities, during their curriculum.
But it's also worth noting as well, there is a surprising amount of engineering here.
Yeah, this is actually really, really quite startling. Rob doesn't necessarily believe this as much as I do, but I believe that these engineering requirements that were added are so specific as to probably have been made specifically to allow some schools who were not otherwise able to get the CO to qualify for the CO. That's a thought process, but it's probably not too far out there.
My opposing theory is that these are in there for the because of the specific needs of the NSA and the intelligence community.
All right, so I said, hey, maybe these are state-sponsored, or we're focusing towards state-sponsored. How did I come up with that conclusion? Well, I came up with that conclusion by looking at the bodies of these. Some of them make sense. So here we see understanding of operating system theory. All right. Some of them are getting a little bit weird, like why am I required to learn about the inner workings of cellular telephone networks as part of my core requirements? That maybe doesn't come up in everybody's security day-to-day job.
And certainly not in a computer science degree.
And some of them are just straight up out there. Now, we can get behind assembly, but in this particular case, the NSA is saying that you should be able to build a telnet client or something akin without using any libraries in assembly. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with any libraries, this means you're not allowed to use operating system calls. You're not allowed to use device drivers. You're not allowed to use any wrappers on top of that. You essentially need to rebuild TCP/IP and then rebuild Telnet on top of TCP/IP. That's a little bit intense and also probably more assembly language than most of you have ever used in your careers.
It does make sense, though, if you're going to be building implants.
It really does. It really does. Cool. So with this, I'm going to hand it over to Rob to talk about some of the future curriculum guidelines and accreditation processes.
Yeah. So where are things headed? Okay. So we've taken a look at where the landscape is now, and it's weird. Okay. Where is it headed? I'm not so sure it's going to get any saner. So all three of the organizations that we've talked about, as well as the IEEE, recognize that there needs to be more cybersecurity somewhere in higher ed. Right. This is a place where it's got to grow. We have the shortfall that we talked about at the beginning, and everyone seems to recognize that what they're currently doing isn't sufficient. So what we tend to see is that, or what we've seen is these organizations jointly form this computer or cybersecurity education project to study the problem. Okay, that's where academia always heads. We need to study the problem first.
We need a committee of committees.
We need a committee of committees.
Yeah, exactly.
That will be managed by another committee.
It's just like government in that sense.
Yeah. With grant money.
Of course.
Yeah. Oh. Just a second.
Are we still up?
Yeah, we're still up.
Okay.
We just lost our speaker note window.
I think we're going to have to go without that.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's somewhere.
All right. You can work it for me.
All right.
Okay. Next bullet, please. Right. So the ACM, of course. So the ACM took the results of this project and decided that they were going to develop create a joint task force to come up with new curriculum recommendations. A new joint task force to study it. But luckily, the joint task force is actually coming up with new recommendations. Initially, it was a little bit weird as to whether this was going to be coming out as under ABAT or ACM, and that actually matters because one is an accreditation and the other is recommendations. Currently, this is coming out under ACM, so this is curriculum recommendations, not an accreditation program yet. but it's very likely that ABET will very soon, from their computer accreditation committee, come up with an accreditation based off of the programs I'm about to show you. It's also worth noting, too, that there are two different efforts within ABET to come up with accreditation. So we have their computing accreditation committee working with ACM, ABET, and IEEE. There's also supposedly the engineering accreditation committee is trying to come up with a cybersecurity engineering accreditation, but there's very little information about that publicly. So ABET is making some revisions to their curriculum. Okay, for general revisions, it's actually getting a little weaker in that it says curriculum must cover security somewhere in an appropriate manner to its discipline. Okay, so it does say that, I guess it does say that security has to be covered somewhere, but it leaves what that is up to the specific discipline. Within CS, we see CS requiring some addition. We see the next version of the ABET CS requirements covering some additional classes that are tangentially related to security, but we're not there yet. Okay, security isn't actually a requirement. For IT, security is no longer a fundamental topic, so a step backwards. And for IS, it is also removed as a topic from that first year. Okay, so here we see a step backwards. And what's happening is that these programs are pulling security out so that they can make security its own beast, which is kind of the opposite trend we see in industry, right? What we see in industry is more people having to do security as part of their day-to-day. Here we're saying we're almost doing the opposite in siloing security in this ACM CSEC 2017. So the ACM CSEC 2017 is the result of that joint task force. This is the curriculum recommendations where we're at right now. There's going to be a number of about 6 primary knowledge areas, or knowledge units, if you will, that have a number of subtopics, and each will delve into those in just a second. And there are some of these cross-cutting concepts that are supposed to be spread out through everything. Okay, so this is the initial version of the CSEC 2017 curriculum that we reviewed, and where things stand. This came out, I think, around March. And what's interesting is a new version of this just dropped at the beginning. A new version of this just dropped at the beginning of the week. So we had to update some of this quickly. So we do see some interesting trends here. Okay, we see relatively little data security except crypto. Okay, we see again relatively little software security, except for maybe fundamental design principles. We see a lot of system security, which kind of makes sense as to where academia has traditionally housed security in terms of operating system and networking. And then we see a number of less technical subject areas that might make this more palatable to a school that already has a strong information systems program. Okay? In particular, pay attention to this societal security, because on the next slide, we're going to see some things that have changed.
Also keep in mind, just a pitch for the next talk that's coming up. This seems very similar to, what certification would you say?
I think it's a 5-letter one that begins with a C.
Yeah, I might say this is pretty similar to the CISSP in terms of its nature of what it covers.
Yeah. So the newest version of the CSEC 17, which is open for comments, if you want to go and if you think this is crazy and want to go comment on this,
we recommend you do.
Yeah, we recommend you do. They will also list you as a contributor, which I found out that I am actually listed as a contributor because I said something on one of the previous versions was weird. Okay. So what we see here is an increased focus on data security, a decreased focus on software security. So I guess AppSec isn't as important.
And of course, some of the other things that you might not have seen in the previous one if you were looking, but are in this one, are some of those weird legal ramifications that we didn't really necessarily care about in the CO, such as just tort law and the Geneva Convention.
That's the next slide.
Oh, and that's the next slide.
Yeah. So hold on. We're not done on this one. So, what we see here is also system security. In the current draft, they said we are revising this. We took the feedback from this, and we decided we need to revamp this. But the revamping of that has pulled a lot of the stuff that was in system security into other areas. okay, that seem more focused on, I guess, policy and less technical concepts related to security than actual implementation. So can you fast forward? Okay, so other interesting changes. So organizational security and societal security saw a number of interesting changes. Within organizational security, there was an a security operations unit added. Within societal security, there were a number of interesting things related to cyber war. Now, certainly, there's a lot of that going on in the media at the moment, and that might be part of the motivating factor. Okay, but it seems interesting that the ACM has started to agree with the NSA that things like military versus civilian cyber law is important. Just war theory is an important subject area for all four-year security students to take. Cyber in war versus cyber war, cyberspace operations, which specifically is cyberspace military operations. Again, that's something that is deemed of critical importance.
The general theme is there's a lot of cyber war going on for not a lot of cyber war in the world per se. 8 sections of cyber war in a curriculum is maybe a little bit hefty, I think.
My favorite is that all security students need to understand the law of armed conflict.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Do you want to take this?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're coming to a close real quick, so let's kind of go through what we would say if you were an employer, what would you take away from this? Well, probably if you were going to be doing secure development, if that was your focus, computing science could at best handle that capacity. That seems a little bit daunting, but it's what the actual documentation says. Additionally, information technology, that actually works well for system administration. Information systems works well for an analyst type role. And we start seeing some of the CSEC 2017 actually having impact on computing security jobs. So for CSEC 2017, generic security analyst, a role that wasn't traditionally filled by any of the other ones. For CSEC 2017, the new version, maybe a less technical security analyst. That's a little bit concerning. When we start seeing CAECD, we start seeing defensive capabilities, which is always something we want to say. And CAECO will give us state-sponsored offense, which is almost really kind of not that incredibly important.
Yeah, not pen testing, but other kinds of offense.
So as a conclusion, we wanted to kind of pull out some facts here just quickly as we're coming very, very quickly to the end of our time, and we don't want to intrude on Mario. We see that most of the graduates who are getting knowledge in computing security come from CS, IT, IS, or CE, which is a little bit concerning given the precedent of the curriculums that are being presented for those. Additionally, we have these two up-and-coming, or we have an ABET up-and-coming accreditation process, which may or may not have any effectiveness, particularly because security is kind of being pulled out of these curriculums in order to go into its own place, which is slightly concerning as a trend. Additionally, we're seeing kind of very broad strokes and not very heavy, deep interplay into these. There was no, for instance, reverse engineering on the CSEC 2017. And we see kind of like the NSA is starting to carve out their own space within this. Now, there's going to be a lot of interesting questions that we don't have time for, I'm sure, about whether or not the NSA should actually be playing as a curriculum accreditation board. The answer is probably not in almost every situation, but there's no one else who's doing it. As we kind of go forward, we're going to see more curricula geared towards blue team instead of both blue team and red team. And we're not necessarily seeing so much industry-based feedback going into this system. So we're not actually seeing a whole lot of industry support for these curriculum events. So if there's something you want to get involved in, that's it. Rob, you want to take this?
Yeah, so we do have some recommendations too, the most significant of which I think is, oh my God, do we need better metrics, right? There's almost no metrics out there. Everyone guards their data. We need to have a much better idea of what the scale of the problem looks like and the scale of what our capabilities are at the moment. It seems like graduate certificates are probably, if a school is looking to get the CAECD, some kind of graduate certificate might be a way to go. It makes sense for any number of programs, IT, engineering, IS. Everybody could find some kind of way to do the CAECD and probably improve their curriculum. Cyber operations does not make a lot of sense for information systems, which I don't think is terribly surprising, but it does seem to be a best fit either for computer science or, surprisingly, computer engineering.
Which does disclude 17% or thereabout of current existing programs from ever having students that graduate that.
Yes. And also, one of the challenges, I think, for the CSEC 2017 curriculum going forward, even if they come up with something that's maybe a little bit more technical than the most recent draft, which I highly encourage everyone to go provide feedback on. It's about 80 pages, but it's not super dense material, is that there is little to no incentive for anyone to actually do this. Okay? If we want some other player in this space besides NSA, there needs to be some kind of incentive for school to do this, other than saying, okay, now we can tell parents we're accredited by AVET. Okay, that's not that much of that's really not that much of a useful thing.
All right. And with that, we're going to probably take questions outside if you have any, since we started a little bit late, but we don't want to make that go on to Mario. So Mario, if you want to come up here and get started,
yeah.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.